Lovely to be here this afternoon online with you all. I had hoped to give this webinar earlier this year, but unfortunately was unable to. So to those of you who've been waiting since the spring to hear what I've got to say, thank you so much for your patience. So what I'm going to talk about this afternoon is decentralised clinical trials, and I will tell you what those are in a minute if you're wondering. And primarily, I'm going to present some of the results of the research that my colleagues and I at the University of Dundee have done as part of the Trials at Home project. So we'll just get started, move on to, oops, skipping slides, here we go. So what is a decentralised clinical trial? Decentralised clinical trials is a relatively new concept, and for that reason, there are a number, or have been a number of different terms used to describe decentralised trials, such as remote trials, home-based trials, virtual trials. But it would appear that industry and academia is now settling on the term decentralised clinical trial to describe a trial where trial activities largely take place where a patient or participant normally is, so either in their home or in a local setting. So the word decentralized is a little bit confusing because it actually is taking the patient at the center rather than the trial site. Our definition within decentralized within trials at home of a DCT is that these are trials that use digital innovations and other related methods to make them more accessible to participants. And I would highlight that other methods here. It's not just about using digital technologies. The key feature is moving the trial activities to where the participant is. And the aim of that is to minimize the inconvenience or the work of having to visit a physical trial centre. Now, there is a number of different decentralised clinical trial method definitions around. You'll see them provided by, for example, the Food and Drug Administration in the US, but they're all in alignment roughly on what a decentralised trial is. But we may see some movement in the terminology over the next few years because it's still quite new. So I mentioned the FDA. The regulators, so the large regulators, are all on board with the concept of decentralised clinical trials, with the proviso that they have to be conducted within the existing regulatory frameworks. So the European Medicines Agency, the MHRA in the UK, FDA in the US, and the smaller agencies within Europe have put out statements on decentralised clinical trials, and you can find them relatively easily. So I'll tell you a bit more about the Trials at Home project. So Trials at Home is a centre of excellence for decentralised clinical trials, and it's a 5-year project that started in September 2019. The aim of the project was to look at clinical trial design, conduct and operations, and ultimately to come up with some standards, recommendations and perhaps tools to promote the use of decentralised trials within Europe. So it's a large project. It's a public-private partnership consortium comprising many academic institutions, including my own, the University of Dundee, as well as large pharmaceutical companies, CROs, and other commercial companies within the clinical trial space. The project is funded by the European Commission's Innovative Medicines Initiative, which we knew as IMI, but has recently changed to IHI, Innovative Health Initiative, with in-kind funding from the pharmaceutical companies or FPA partners. And you can see from this slide the partners that are involved in the project at the moment. Because it's one of these public-private partnership projects, I do need to show this disclaimer before I tell you anything else. This is research that we've done in the University of Dundee, and what I say this afternoon is me speaking as a researcher and not the project as a whole or our funders. So it's a very large project, and like most large projects, it's broken down into segments for operational purposes. The main ones to be aware of in the Trials at Home project are BEST, which is around best practices in decentralised trials, TECH, looking at technology, RADIAL, which is running a feasibility trial, a proof of concept trial, which is ongoing at the moment, and EAGLE, looking at the ethical and regulatory aspects of DCTs. And CODE and PROMS are around about project management and communications within and outside the project. The work I'm going to talk about this afternoon falls under work package 1 or BEST. So we have produced 3 academic publications from BEST, and what I'm going to talk about this afternoon is the results of these 3 publications. So first of all, a systematic review of the methods used to conduct decentralized clinical trials. Then what we went ahead and did was some case study interviews, and we have published 2 qualitative analyses looking at people's experiences of running and taking part in decentralized clinical trials. And to that, I'm going to add some practical insights that we've generated more recently from our case study research. So the systematic review. This was a standard systematic review with a prospectively registered protocol on Prospero. The data was collected in spring of 2020. So if you cast your mind back, that is just as we were heading into the lockdown phase of COVID-19. We screened or searched academic databases and clinicaltrials.gov, pharmaceutical company websites, and also various sources of grey literature, looking for publications that reported or discussed decentralized clinical trials and the methods used to conduct them. We identified 18,500 potentially relevant records and screened them down to identify 237 publications that were talking about decentralized clinical trials. From those 237, 117 were discussing the concept of decentralized clinical trials and the methods used to conduct them. And they were included in our qualitative data extraction. We also identified 45 randomized control trials that had been conducted using decentralized clinical trial methods, either completely, so a fully remote trial, or a hybrid model where some trial visits still took part at a clinical study site. So those 45 trials were included in our quantitative data analysis. Our quantitative outcomes were largely around recruitment and retention, but we were also interested in the cost of conducting these trials, and we wanted to see just what methods were trial organisers using in order to achieve decentralisation. Our primary outcome, however, was number of randomised participants. So as I said, searches were conducted in early 2020. And we identified 45 decentralized clinical trials. 17 of these were fully remote trials, and 28 were partially remote. I think I've got those the right way around. The trials had a huge range of number of participants, ranging from only 10 participants right up to almost 40,000 in a single trial, but the median was 375. These trial methods are being used for all patient age groups. Most of them were taking part in a general adult population, as we would expect when looking at a general clinical trial methodology. The majority of the trials that we identified in the review were being run from the UK or North America, but we did identify 7 which were multinational trials with participants in at least 2 countries. And as you might expect, we identified many different methods being used to achieve decentralization, or in plain English, being used to allow participants to remain at home while they take part in the trial. These range from very simple methods such as postal trials, conducted entirely by snail mail, right up to very high-tech trials with patient-facing websites and apps, collecting information using devices, perhaps combining that with routinely collected data from, for example, NHS databases. Some trials were sampling biological substances like blood and urine. And increasingly, we start to see, heading towards the 2000s, the use of telemedicine to communicate with clinical trial participants. Overall, we found insufficient evidence to demonstrate any benefit of DCT methods in terms of recruitment, retention, or cost. And this conflicts with a lot of the discussion papers that we saw at the beginning of the project, which were touting decentralization as something of a magic bullet to solve the problems of recruitment and retention and escalating clinical trial costs. It's possible that DCTs do improve these, but the evidence is not there yet. So moving on to the qualitative outcomes from the systematic review. We were interested in identifying the facilitators and barriers of using this method and the resulting advantages and disadvantages. And we really wanted to hear what patients and other stakeholders, such as regulators and healthcare organisations, thought of decentralised clinical trials. So as I mentioned, there were 117 publications included in this analysis, or this data extraction. And these papers dated right back to 1988, before the term was even coined, but trials were being done at that point using decentralised methods, up to 2020 when we started our data extraction. And we found 28 advantages and 25 disadvantages, but those numbers are not particularly informative. So we split the factors into themes, and those themes were value, burden, safety, and equity. So to look at value, most papers talking about DCTs felt that they would be better for generalizability because patients are in their usual setting, and they may indeed include a wider group of patients than trials taking part in trial sites. But many people conceded that they would not be suitable for some research questions. And that makes sense. If you need a CT scan or an MRI scan, you can't do that in a participant's home yet. Moving on to burden. If a participant doesn't have to travel to a trial site, then that relieves the burden of trial participation. However, if you replace that single study site visit where a nurse does everything for you, with a participant having to set up and manage a number of data collection devices, that may actually be a larger burden, even without the travel. Moving on to safety. Decentralized clinical trials, particularly those using digital technologies, can use continuous passive monitoring. And that should be better than asking a patient every 2 weeks, did anything happen to you in the last 2 weeks? However, if you don't have a face-to-face connection with a patient, it can be hard to ensure understanding, both of what's happening in the trial and what the patient should be expecting. But also, if there is a safety event, it's difficult to know for the patient who they should be telling about something and if they should be telling somebody about it at all. So communication is a big challenge for safety in decentralized trials. And finally, equity. I've mentioned travel as being a barrier to trial participation. Other barriers, such as needing to attend work or having caring responsibilities, may be eased by decentralized clinical trial participation. But at the same time, if these are digital trials requiring people to engage with them through smartphones or other devices, we may be excluding members of society who perhaps are not familiar or don't have access to these types of devices and the skills you need in order to use them. So our key finding from the systematic review was that the convenience of at-home participation needed to be balanced against the potential of transferring burden to study participants and making them do the work that was previously done by study staff. So moving on to the case studies. We selected case studies within the Trials at Home project, and we did this right at the beginning of the project by asking for proposals from all our trial partners for trials that had used decentralized methods. We also conducted a scoping review within our team at the University of Dundee, trying to identify in the literature key decentralized clinical trial projects. And while in order to go about that and to help us choose a spread of case studies, we created a structured data capture tool, which is illustrated on the slide here. We wanted to have a spread of case studies so that we could find out information about all of these aspects. So we wanted to know about patient or participant engagement. We wanted to know about the operational aspects of setting up trials, right from setup through to closeout and reporting. And we also wanted to know what the issues are with handling data in these types of trials. And ultimately, through an iterative process with agreement within our work package, we came up with a list of 20 case studies that we felt were representative of the activity going on in the clinical trial space. These case studies were presented by our FPA partners, so large drug companies. We also had some presented by small and medium enterprise partners, and of course the academic partners within the project, and some of our academic colleagues out with the project who were also doing interesting things in the decentralized trial space. As we found in our systematic review, the majority of these trials were based in North America and Europe, and in the case studies, the participants were largely in these areas. We had only one case study where the participants were in Asia, and we had 5 multi-continent case studies. They crossed a number of therapeutic areas, largely in cardiovascular and diabetes, which is fairly well reflective of the number of clinical trials going on anyway, but what's missing from this is oncology. So in our first 20 case studies, we did not have any oncology trials. At the time of doing the analysis that led to the publications I mentioned earlier, 2 of the case studies were still in setup phase. 11 of them were ongoing trials and 7 were completed and reported. We conducted 48 semi-structured interviews with clinical trial staff, trial managers and administrators, technical staff such as programmers and software developers, vendors providing clinical trial services such as home nursing, and also we had 2 patient representatives who had been involved in DCTs. We would have liked more patient representatives. So the first thing we looked at was what methods were being used in these case studies. And there was a huge variety, from digital methods such as smartphone apps, wearables, websites, through to different methods of obtaining consent, with e-consent increasingly becoming common, not just in DCTs, but in conventional clinical trials. Several of our case studies used home nursing in order to deliver infusions, local health workers collecting data, and even telemedicine to interact with participants. I've already mentioned wearables, with trials using connected devices to collect data, not just physiological data from participants, but also environmental data and adherence monitoring. Some of these trials use social media for recruitment. Several of them used a direct-to-participant model where they delivered trial materials, including trial drug or IMP, straight to participants. Several of them used a healthcare embedded model, and many of them used routinely collected data to augment data collected directly by the trial. And we were pleased to see that some of our case studies, at least, did have significant public and patient involvement and participant involvement in their conduct. So the process that we went through with our interviews, these were one-to-one recorded interviews, and we asked each interviewee what worked well in the trial you were involved in. What were the challenges that you were aware of, and how did you tackle them, or how did the team tackle them? And if you could do this trial again in future, what would you do to avoid the challenges? These interviews were all recorded and transcribed, and the transcriptions of the interviews became our data set for our thematic analysis. And in the thematic analysis, what we were aiming to do was to understand how people had experienced decentralized clinical trials. We wanted to explore their experiences and then identify common themes that occurred across all of the interviews. So these were the themes that we identified in our initial thematic analysis. These were facilitators and barriers to recruitment and to engagement, technology-related challenges and the solutions used to deal with them. Transfer burden, again, came out in our case studies. Came across several people talking about challenges with data flow. And in our later interviews, we started to hear about additional challenges being raised by COVID-19. So the conclusion to that analysis was that in order to maximize participant and partner involvement, was that it was important to maximize participant and partner involvement, that it was necessary to simplify participant experience as well as the workflow for study staff with the aim of reducing burden. And that together, those should hopefully help with recruitment, engagement, and retention. So those findings made us think, is there something special about decentralised clinical trials and recruitment, retention, and engagement? Many of our interviewees talk about engagement, but it wasn't always clear that they were all talking about the same thing. So we decided to go back into the data and do a secondary analysis, looking specifically at when people talked about engagement, trying to get it down to what they meant and whether there was something specific about the decentralized approach that was relevant to engagement. So again, we did a thematic analysis looking to see what the common themes that we could identify or that we could derive from the data. And the themes that we came up with were the perceived value of decentralized trial participation. And within that, how relatable the aim of the study was to the participants. Did they understand what the study was for? And did it mean anything to them personally? Useful feedback came up quite a lot. Participants seemed to value getting useful data back out of the trial. And staff had noticed that and commented on it. And targeted recruitment came up again and again within study teams, that it wasn't enough just to recruit lots and lots of people through social media, but you need to recruit the right people with a targeted approach. After value came the burden of decentralized trial participation. Again, this idea that although trials were designed to make it easy for patients to participate, that some were harder than others. There were issues with familiarity with study activities and technology. This idea that the equipment and the jobs that a participant had to do might seem simple to study staff, but when presented to participants at home alone without support, they could become very tricky and they could be a barrier to ongoing participation. Simple instructions and interfaces came up again and again, just to ease the task of engaging with these unfamiliar activities and technologies. And another thing that came up, which we were somewhat surprised about, was choice. Many participants and staff felt that offering choice to participants may help to reduce burden and to increase retention within the trial. And the last theme, but possibly the most important, trust. It was very important for trial participants and trial staff to trust each other. And in order to maintain that trust and to build that trust, communication and maintaining contact were very important. So our conclusions from that secondary analysis were synthesized into this figure, which you can see in our published paper and also on the slide I'm showing at the moment, with the idea that the individual participant is at the center and that it's their values and circumstances that dictate how successful recruitment, retention, and adherence will be. And given that you cannot interrogate every potential participant before you recruit them, it becomes essential to involve patients and public involvement as an exercise to try to understand what those values and circumstances may be in your potential participants and to design the trial around that. So I'm just going to go on in the last few minutes to give you some more perhaps practical insights from our case studies. And these are likely to find their way into our final project outputs, which will be recommendations for decentralized clinical trials. I've broken them down into different aspects of decentralized clinical trials, as you can see here, with participant-centered design at the center, and with a number of different aspects of trial design and conduct that need to be considered. I probably won't cover all of these today, but if you'd like to find out more about this aspect of Trials at Home, do visit the Trials at Home website where you can see more. So early and sustained stakeholder engagement. This has been identified by many interviewees as a key to a successful decentralised trial. And that is engagement not just with potential participants or groups representing them, but also with the healthcare providers who may be helping to recruit participants and who may also be the ultimate consumers of the evidence that you're generating. With data holders, if you're planning to use routinely collected data, it's important to engage early with these organisations so that they know what you need, what sort of data you need and when you need it. And also with the regulatory bodies. If this is a phase 3 licensing trial, the regulators such as the EMA will want to know early that you're planning to use decentralised methods. They have methods such as the Scientific Advisory Board, which you can use to get information from them and discuss your plans with them. And the whole point of all this engagement is to build trust with the organisations, hopefully to prevent delays in access to data and in approvals, and ultimately to facilitate successful recruitment. So if we look at engagement with patients, we have a good quotation here from one of our trial staff interviewees, who talked about how important it was to engage the patients within their trial. They felt that their patient representatives had a massive impact on recruitment because they were involved in developing the recruitment materials, which included personalised stories about their experiences. So the learning point from that is that you need to engage patients early enough so that you can actually do something with their suggestions. This trial did engage participants early, but even then, there were some things that they couldn't do because they didn't know about them until it was too late and their approvals had already gone through. So in terms of participant and patient engagement, earlier is better. With data holders, I don't know how many of you in the audience have been involved in trying to access routinely collected data for clinical trials, but it is an onerous process. It takes a lot of time. These data are not collected primarily for trials, and it may take a bit of explanation with the people who own the data for them to understand why you want the data and what you're going to do with it. And this quotation from one of our trial staff interviewees just illustrates that they had challenges because the person they were asking for data from didn't really understand clinical research, and why should they? And we've got some advice from one of our technical trial staff saying, get in there early, get your application started early, don't wait until you need the data because you will take a long time to get it. And in this study, they found that they waited until they needed the data, they put in their application, and then it was another 3 years until they actually got it. And you can imagine how frustrating that must have been. Resources. DCTs have been touted as being a cheaper way of running trials. And it may be that you can run a cheaper trial using decentralization, but you do have to resource them properly. There are many things to consider. If you're using a new study design or new technologies, then you will have to test them. Approvals can take longer because people are unfamiliar with the model. You may need to contract with vendors providing services who you haven't contracted with before. If you're passing large amounts of data, that may bring additional information governance concerns. And you may not have the staff with the skills or the training in order to run a trial like this. So recruitment may add time onto your timescales as well. And then during the study, project management is absolutely essential, particularly if you're using vendors. If you've got technical devices, you may need specific technical support for staff and even for participants. You may even need to run a help desk, which you might not have done in a conventional trial. Vendor and site selection becomes very important for global trials. The global trials environment is changing very quickly. Decentralized clinical trials is just one of these changes, and many existing trial sites and investigators are unfamiliar with the concept of decentralized trials. Added to that, there are a huge number of new players coming into the clinical trials marketplace, developing technologies and services that are promoted to allow you to do a decentralized clinical trial. In addition to these new service providers and technologies, the traditional CROs who are used to running conventional trials are starting to pivot to decentralized methods. And it all becomes very difficult to select who you're going to use to help run your trial. I'd like to give an example from one of our case studies, which used a number of different vendors to conduct their trial. The trial had blood sampling, so it involved laboratory testing. It used clinical sites with recruitment networks, but it also had a digital platform that people engaged with once they'd been recruited. And because the materials used in the trial had to be sent temperature controlled, they had to use a specialist temperature controlled logistics vendor. This was very challenging to the project management team who we interviewed, both with coordinating these different vendors, but also because some of the vendors had never been involved in trials before. Add to that, they were using technologies, and many of the trial staff hadn't had any experience with the digital technologies that were being used. The solutions that were proposed, and some of them implemented in this trial, were to prefer going for an integrated or full service CRO who could provide all of the digital and decentralized elements rather than using several different vendors. To favor experienced sites and vendors, although if it's an early in the decentralized clinical trial journey, there are many sites who are not yet experienced. And also what happened in this case was they actually set up a joint vendor-sponsored digital team to iron out the problems that they were having between the two teams. And finally, something very important for this trial, time zones. This was a multinational trial with vendors, study teams, and sites in many different time zones. And to begin with, they didn't have a solid communication plan for dealing with these time zone differences. So this quotation helps to illustrate that. The lack of knowledge that they had of clinical trials itself was a problem because we felt we would tell them one thing and they understood exactly what they were going to do. And it wasn't until later that it became apparent they didn't understand. So I believe this case study, although it may have been one of the others, dealt with a digital vendor who had never done a clinical trial before. And when the sponsor was talking about day one of the trial, this vendor imagined that every trial participant started on the same calendar date, as if they were lined up at the start line of a race. And they said, go, and they all went through the trial at the same time. It was several months down the line before the sponsor realized that this was the understanding of the vendor of how a clinical trial worked. And they had to disabuse the sponsor of this and say, no, actually the patients come in one at a time and every patient will have a different day one. This resulted in the software having to be completely redesigned for this trial, and it cost a huge amount of money and time. It was a major issue. It could have been sorted with communication at the start or by partnering with a vendor who was already familiar with clinical trials. So you need to be aware of the regulations as well. As I said at the beginning, decentralized clinical trials can be done within the existing regulatory framework for clinical trials. And that regulatory framework is complicated. Although we have the international guidance from ICH GCP, this gets filtered through various supranational and national organisations to produce different regulations, legislation and guidance. You need to be familiar what is applicable in each place where you're conducting the trial. And it's not just about clinical trial regulations. There may be other things you're doing in the trial which are covered by other regulation, such as home nursing, medical licensing, pharmacy, devices. So we had one case study where they were unable to recruit across the whole of the US, which was their intention, because they had to have a doctor licensed in every state. The states would not accept licensing across borders, and that meant that they had to limit the size of the trial. Our colleagues in Work Package 4 of Trials at Home have produced a map of the applicable EU legislation on decentralised trials, and I would encourage you to go and take a look at this diagram a bit closer up on the website, where you can explore it and find out more about it. If you want to know about the regulations in non-EU countries, the Decentralised Trial Research Alliance, I think it stands for DTRA in the US, do have a database of regulations relevant to clinical trials. Another example case study. This was an early phase trial which was using a wearable patch device to detect arrhythmia. And the device itself was being shipped from the US to Europe. The sponsor was US based, but the trial was taking part in Europe. Because of national variations in customs and clearances and taxes, they had unexpected delays and they couldn't get the patch to the patients on time. What that company ended up doing was actually setting up a local depot within Europe simply to distribute the patches to the participants. Participant-centred design and feasibility testing is very important in DCTs. User-focused design is key. Testing new technologies, both the technologies in isolation, but also the setup of all the technologies connected to each other. The testing needs to be done not just by trial staff, but also potential trial participants or people very similar to them. And you need to be responsive to early feedback. There's no point asking people to test something if you're not going to then do something about it. We got quite a lot of feedback about participant-centred design from our case studies. We had one case where there was a biosensor that collected data from participants' chests, but it turned out that participants weren't using them because they had flashing lights that showed through their shirts. And it took a long time to work out why people weren't using the sensors. Perhaps that would have been found out earlier if they just asked a patient what they thought of the sensor. Another aspect of testing is one device may be perfectly easy for someone to use, but multiple devices becomes very difficult. And one case study really struggled with retention in their trial, and they feel that it was because they just tried to use too many different devices. They thought, we've got the technology, let's use it, let's collect more data. And as a result, participants were overwhelmed by the amount of things they were being asked to connect and interact with. Communication, absolutely key, as you've probably already worked out from some of the things I'm talking about. It's really important in a decentralized trial, just as in a conventional trial, that everybody knows what their roles and responsibilities are. But because there is not face-to-face contact between trial staff, vendors and participants, you need to be explicit in your expectations about what people should be doing and who they should be telling. And having defined communication procedures with a contingency plan that defines who tells who when things happen is very important. Another aspect of communication is just getting the communication right for the audience that you're giving it to. So this participation or this trial staff quotation felt that the text that they were using to try and recruit participants was just too much. But they needed to involve participants or partners in improving their materials. And they felt that that aspect, that participant engagement and improvement impacted greatly on their trial. And I've already mentioned contingency planning. Things happen in decentralized clinical trials, just like they do in conventional trials. All sorts of things happen to our case studies. We had weather events, unexpected taxes, lengthy approvals, shipping delays, websites not working, devices not working, adverse news coverage affecting patients and prompting them to drop out of the study or stop adhering to their study treatment. And then we had the massive event, pandemics. COVID-19 had an enormous impact on clinical trials, all clinical trials. Decentralized trials were affected, but not as much. And I think that's probably the reason that they will become a fixture in clinical trials in the future. So what comes next for trials at home? Well, we have collected additional case studies. We now have 9 more case studies in 6 more therapeutic areas. And we are looking forward to analysing the data from those case studies. The interviews are almost complete for the last one. And we're looking forward to finding out more about social media outreach within these trials, home nursing, apps and platforms and wearables, and anything else that comes up out of the interviews. So there's still a lot to learn from decentralised trials, and we're looking forward to doing so. So that's all I wanted to say this afternoon. Thank you so much for your attention. You can ask any questions just now, but if you want to contact me or the Trials at Home project, I've put the contact details up on this slide.